Hi, everyone. Welcome to Persona Interviews. I'm Rob Similcare. Happy Easter week. Happy Passover to all of you celebrating this week. I am really privileged to be joined by someone I've gotten to know as the assistant minister of the church that I attend in Weston, Connecticut, Thomas Burke. Thomas, it's great to speak to you this Holy Week. How are you?
Good to be here. I'm doing good. It's a wonderful opportunity to be creative and to be the church right now.
It is. We've been having church services over YouTube, and so you've become a producer and it's a YouTube star instead of just a Protestant minister. Probably not what you had in mind.
You know, I never signed up to be a televangelist, but I guess that's what Reverend Bernard and I are becoming. Yeah.
So Reverend Burke, and I call you Thomas, but I'll call you Reverend Burke this week since it's Holy Week. Your story, and I've gotten to hear bits and pieces of it in church, is so fascinating. A military veteran, you fought in Iraq, you were in the Marines there and saw some pretty serious things, I'm sure, in your time stationed there. You went through some really difficult times being discharged from the military and without an honorable discharge, and drug abuse and mental health issues. And your story just fascinates me. I think it's one that people really need to hear in this time when we're all going through such struggles, even during Holy Week. So I just want to start a little bit with your background. You grew up here in Connecticut in Bethel. You were Catholic when you grew up and were attracted to two things, which some people might find unusual for one person to be attracted to both the Catholic priesthood on one hand and the Marines on the other hand. How did those two things sort of both draw your interest?
Sure. So I think, they both really have a lot of power involved. I think that they both, if you look at their uniforms, they're very attractive. They're the Marine Corps, obviously, everybody thinks is the best uniform, the dress blues.
At least Marines do, yeah.
At least Marines do. That's a good point. And Catholics have a wonderful amount of a pageantry, an aesthetic that allows them to grow closer to God. And I think the two ideas of order, power, and structure were things that I was very attracted to from a young age. Maybe it's because I lacked those things personally, but I think I also was, as somebody who grew up in a family of five, who didn't always have their voice heard, wanted to seek to have opportunities to have power where I could be heard or could have some sort of opportunity to act on.
So you actually started studying to be a priest. You started to go down that path, and then how did you end up from that path to becoming a Marine?
So yeah, I did. I started studying to become a Jesuit, and it was very interesting. My senior year of high school, I was somebody who was not necessarily a good kid in high school, but I was also known as the kid who went to church every Sunday and was very religious. And around senior year, when people were deciding what to do, I really didn't see an opportunity to go to college. I didn't see that future for myself. I don't think I had people around me who thought that was an option for me. And so I didn't see any other future. And so I joined the Marine Corps. Really not so much out of panic. It's something I wanted to do my whole life, but also I didn't really know anything else to do. And so October of my senior year of high school, I joined the Marine Corps. But also one of the things I say is, if you really think the Catholic priesthood is also it's a lifelong commitment. And I think a lot of what I was doing was running away from the Catholic priesthood. And I ran to war. So I ran pretty far away.
Sounds like you were running away in one hand, but looking for structure, right? I mean, these are two incredibly structured hierarchies, the Catholic Church and the military. It doesn't get much more hierarchical or structural than either of those things, and they both attracted you. What do you think was drawing you toward this structure? Was it some structure that you were missing in your own life?
I don't think it's the combination, and these are all really stark dichotomies, because it's the combination of the structure that I saw in my life growing up and was attracted to, and the structure I didn't have personally. So I think I look at my family structure, which is, I have I have 4 brothers and sisters, 3 sisters and a brother, 2 amazing parents who are still together. So I saw that order and structure created who I am, and I appreciated that. And so I looked to other organizations who had similar sets of values and sets of order, because I wanted that for myself, and didn't think that I was maybe had the ambition, the hard work, the opportunity to be that myself. Yeah.
So when were you stationed in Iraq? When did that deployment take place, and what was that like?
Sure. So I went to Iraq in 2008. Iraq was interesting. We were there for 8 months. We were in Iraq, both Iraq and Afghanistan, for 8 months. And in Iraq, we were very mobile. This was in 2008, towards the end of the civil war in Iraq, in Al-Anbar province, where we were stationed right outside of Fallujah, in a town called Marja, in a town called Karma. And so we were really working hand in hand with the Iraqi police, with the Iraqi security forces, trying to secure their area of operations, the area around us. And we were driving. We were covering a lot of area, and so we were driving everywhere. And so improvised explosive devices were a lot of the threat. There was a heavy operational tempo, but it was not. It was very stressful. At some point, they began just blowing up the Iraqi security forces in front of us. They weren't really interested in us. We had already signed a status of forces agreement saying we would leave, and so they kind of knew we were leaving. And so they were kind of just trying to destabilize what we had been doing. It was very stressful, especially I was 19. I mean, I was a 19-year-old kid carrying 200 pounds worth of gear. I was not a heavy guy. So it was physically stressful. It was mentally stressful. And geopolitically, I didn't know what was going on. I'm a 19-year-old kid. I don't have, the capacity to understand the mission in which I was a part of at the time.
Did you, during that time, did you wonder why you were there? Did you have second thoughts? Or did you feel all the way through that time, when you're seeing these things, that you'd made the right decision to be there?
I mean, I think, again, on a micro scale, we were being very productive. We were making relationships with the locals. We were building bridges. We were really, we were stopping Al-Qaeda. There were things that we were actively doing in our little area of operations that were very productive. And so that's a lot of what I saw. And then when you get into the macro idea, there were times when I would stand on post with a friend and be like, what are we even doing here? And also think that I wanted to be a Marine my whole life, and I'm miserable doing it. And so there was a lot of, just, of course, in war, there's a lot of time, there's a lot of reflection, introspection. And so there are opportunities to think about that macro, what is going on around me? How am I a member of something bigger than me? And we did question that. I mean, we never questioned orders. We would never think about not participating. There were people who would hurt themselves so they wouldn't have to go on deployment or something like that. But that really never occurred to me.
So there was a time, obviously, Thomas, and we know this from your story, that things started to go not so well for you in the military. It took a turn for the negative. Talk about that. What happened?
Sure. So I think, one of the things about when it turns negative, I think universally war is abnormal. I think universally war is traumatic. And so when we send women and men to war, we should not expect that to be a normal, just like what we're going through right now with coronavirus.
Yeah.
I think this is not normal. And to expect it to be normal is to not appreciate how traumatic it is, and to allow ourselves to feel. And so just going to war was difficult on me personally, on my soul, on my psyche, on who I am. But it was also when an experience in Afghanistan when I spoke Arabic and Pashto, and so I could communicate with the locals. And a lot of the kids in Afghanistan would send us or would bring us or tell us where IEDs were, where improvised explosives were. And so, or they would bring them to us because these kids were really cool, or crazy. And so one of the days they were swimming in a canal that was right outside of our little combat outpost, and they found an RPG warhead in the canal, and they were bringing it to us, and it exploded on them. And these are kids that followed me on patrol every day, that I grew to love and appreciate, and feel close to and feel protective of. And then we had to go, my platoon had to go and clean up their body parts. And so really after that, we already were smoking hash to deal with the stress of what we had seen. But for me, I remember, just thinking I really just want to get high and never think about this again, because, you think, again, what we're going through right now is very hard. But at the time, I was a 20-year-old kid, and I was like, I will never see anything harder than this. This is it. I don't know much about life, but I don't think I'll ever see something worse than this.
Yeah,
and so I really
want to live and tell about it as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so I really wanted to excise that from my memory.
And for you, the way to do that was substances.
Absolutely. And then I think, at some point, going back to that dichotomy, that I didn't want to forget them. There was a part of me that also used substances to access those memories, because I was afraid if I let that memory go, those kids, I would be letting those kids go. And so that's something that personally today weighs on me heavily, is the combination of the trauma and grief that I experienced in that event with the reality of recognizing those kids, and recognizing, who they were and their memory. That is a part of me. So yeah, it's not easy.
No, there's.
Oh yeah, so that's when things got a little difficult.
Yeah, puts things in perspective, what we're going through now. So how did your military service end?
So I ended up admitting to my platoon sergeant that I was using hash the week before we left Afghanistan. A few weeks before that, I had attempted suicide. But just because I did that doesn't mean you can just leave Afghanistan or just leave war. There was still some time left in our deployment.
So your commanding officers knew about this suicide attempt, but that wasn't enough to have you discharged.
No. So they also knew we were using substances. There was the worry and anxiety was that we were bringing that drug abuse back to Hawaii, back to our home in America, to leave it in Afghanistan. And so that there was a few people that were given administrative separations, like myself, who were given punitive decisions to kind of make a example of, to show that you can't do this because this is what's going to happen if you do that. So there was part of me who was the scapegoat, and there was part of me who was very wounded. And at the end of the day, I needed help. And so where was I going to find somebody advocating for me to get help? And so when I admitted that drug use to my commanding or to my platoon sergeant, that started a chain of events that resulted in me going to rehab in San Diego. In order to go to rehab, I had to agree to take this other than honorable discharge. So in order to get treatment for my substance abuse, I had to agree to get kicked out of the military, which I'm 21. I just turned 21 in the plane on the way back from Afghanistan. I have no idea what it means. I don't know anything. I was very naive and I was very injured. I was not in my right state of mind. And so I wanted to do anything I could to get treatment and get help. And so I did that, which I'm glad I did. Getting kicked out was very difficult and still is. But I really needed treatment and I got that.
And was that treatment effective for you?
It was. So going to rehab was, I remember, so it's a large investment. Just fiscally, it's a large investment to send somebody to rehab. And so they don't usually send a 21-year-old because there's no return on that investment. They only send people who are career enlisted, career officers, because they want to maintain, because there's some incentive to keep them in the organization. And so when I was a 21-year-old who had been to combat, who had been to 2 different combat deployments in a room full of hundreds of active duty military who were 30, 40 years old, 50 years old, who had been in the military for 20, 30 years. And they all looked up to me because of my story, because of my opportunity to share what I had been through. I recognized how my narrative helps. And so I think rehab was one of the most helpful things for me, because it was recognizing that if I own my narrative, if I can be transparent, if I can be honest and vulnerable about what I have been through, other people can find strength in that. And so I think also I'll tangent on being a minister. That's what being a minister is, I think, is pointing to Jesus, pointing to the resurrection and saying, look at this thing that you can have access to, that there is new life, that there is new possibility after grief, after death. And so rehab really gave me the tools, the coping mechanisms, the identity. I think before that, the Marine Corps tried to strip my identity when they kicked me out. But
it's part of what they do, right? Yeah,
of what they exactly. But I reclaimed who Thomas was, and I think even 10 years later, that's something I'm learning as a young pastor, is learning who Thomas is, not what a pastor Thomas is, or who Thomas is.
So you're in your early 20s. You've been less than honorably discharged from the military. You've had a bout with drug abuse. You've attempted suicide. And where do you go from there? What do you do?
So I went to my parents' basement, like most 20-year-olds do for a while. I really didn't have those benefits that most veterans get when they get home. I didn't have the GI Bill. I didn't have any of those benefits. Fortunately, after living in my parents' basement for a few months, the VA looked at my medical record. They didn't look at and they recognized that I had an other than honorable discharge charge, but they looked at everything that I had been through and they were like, wow, he probably deserves to get some help. And so there was a decision that was made by the VA, which is different than the DOD and the VA are 2 different departments, obviously.
Yes, because you're still a veteran. Despite your discharge, you are still a veteran.
Well, so that's actually the decision that was made. Technically, you are not a veteran. So technically, I went to Iraq and Afghanistan and was not a veteran. But the VA looked at my records and they did decide that they made a characterization of service decision. And they said that the characterization of my service was honorable. And so I was able to receive a disability rating, which gave me a monthly stipend, which gave me access to educational benefits so I could apply to school. And so it was that decision. It was the VA recognizing that I did deserve to have benefits. That really, because if that didn't happen, I don't know where I'd be 10 years later.
Wow, that's fascinating. People talk about the VA and it's not always positive, but that's a pretty significant turn for you.
Well, I think there's an incentive for a lot of people to make it look like the VA is a certain way. The VA is socialized healthcare. It is government run. And I think a lot of people are worried if it looks too good. Personally, again, what I've just told you is I got a monthly stipend and educational benefits for my and that's what got me the career I have today. That's how I became a productive member of society. So the VA is just like any other organization. People will judge it how it, but I very much appreciate the benefits that
So you go through this. You had been a Catholic growing up. How did you end up in the Protestant priesthood? What led to that? Did you had you already sort of left the Catholic fold? What was the move there?
So I've done a lot of thinking about this too, as well as, I talked a little bit about my family before, and a lot of what I study now is something called family systems theory. And it's how we attach ourselves to the systems in our lives. And so I think that the Marine Corps kicking me out, that gave me the opportunity to then leave other organizations that I was very emotionally attached to. And so I was very emotionally attached to the Roman Catholic Church. But I came home and a few translations were different because of Vatican II was going into effect. And so I came back to a different liturgy. And so I was coming back to a different organization, and I needed familiarity at that time. And I didn't get it in the church. And so I went to the Episcopal Church, which did give me a sense of, and so I already had permission to start leaving. And I think, that's one of the things about the American dream is leaving that sense of comfort, our sense of normative tradition, and finding what fits for us. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I kind of was given permission to do. And so when I talked about before running away from the priesthood by running to the Marine Corps, I really just ran towards the United Church of Christ. And I never recognized that because it was always me seeking, it was always me searching. And so that transition as a young man who was still trying to find their way in the world, I was giving, this explicit permission to start to continue exploring, to be able to reclaim different traditions as my own. And again, I have that power and privilege to do so. And so I went to Yale Divinity School as an Episcopal, as an Episcopalian, and very quickly found out that's not where I wanted to call home.
A little too close to Catholicism, was it? Or
there was the similar bureaucracy involved. I enjoy, not to tangent too much, I enjoy the United Church of Christ because we are free. Every one of us, you are free to believe what you want. I am free to believe what I want. And I think that we are made in the image of God, and our uniqueness makes us stronger. And the uniformity, I think, is sometimes creates division.
What was it like with the experience you had, and the ups and the downs and the struggles and the substance abuse? How was it going around looking for your first job in the ministry? These things must have come up. How did you answer these questions? What was that? Job interviewing is hard. This sounds like a really hard set of job interviews.
I love job interviews. Job interviews are so, honestly, and there were multiple churches when I applied out of seminary. I really enjoy, because you get to know, it's I don't want, this makes it kind of sound bad, but I'll describe Reverend, it's kind of like dating. And Reverend Wilson and I describe it as what I have with my senior pastor is a marriage. We fight, we love each other, we respect each other, we need each other, and we need to invest in that relationship. And so for me, I have never been able to not go into a room and not been transparent about what I've been through. One of the first things I said to Norfield on the first night I met two people, the first initial contact was, I'm not going to give up my advocacy. That's not something that I'll do. I think that that's a huge part of my ministry, is standing up for the vulnerable and the oppressed. That's what we are called to do by Jesus. And so I'm not going to stop doing that for a job.
And for those watching who don't know, Bernard Wilson, the senior minister of your church, in our church, Northfield, also has a military background, was a Navy chaplain. How much did that play into your choice of Northfield and his choice of you?
I think a huge amount. I think that's a really interesting caveat to that question. How much did he choose me? Because I think, and now I'm a little less naive and a little more experienced, I think it was a lot more Bernard chose me than anything. I absolutely chose Bernard. For me, I'm very attracted to mentors that are strong women, usually rather than men. Men, for a variety of reasons, especially what I've seen in the military, are very corruptible and want power for the wrong reasons. And so I look up to Bernard in a lot of different ways. And so meeting him, recognizing the wisdom that he had coming from his military experience, but not just his military experience, but him as a man, and him as a pastor. And so I saw those things and I said, I really wanted to learn from him. And I really initially, I had a lot of good first impressions with Northfield. And so, him being the assistant chaplain of the Navy, which he was at one point, was a big deal. Andrew, who was also our administrator, was a master chief. It's a big deal. And so I did absolutely, that definitely attracted me to, but also I wanted to be an associate minister, I think. I absolutely want to be a senior minister, but I'm very young. I'm 30 years old. I'm going to be doing this in 20 years. So the idea is not to go gray when you're 30 and stress out being a senior pastor, because that's for him.
Right.
The idea is when I'm his age, I'm better than, if not as good as. And so it's a marathon, not a sprint.
It is. I can't help but think, listening to your story, you in our church services on Sunday, you are the person who does the children's sermon. The kids come up to the front and you give them a lesson and then they all run off to Sunday school. Mm-hmm. Do you ever think about those kids that you left behind in Afghanistan when those kids come up to the front of church? Is there some commonality there for you?
Yeah. So every time, and it's very difficult. For a variety of reasons. For a long time, I try really hard to be good at those children's sermons. I know they're not the greatest, but it's hard for me to do those. I love kids so much. Working with kids in a variety of different ways sometimes is a highlight of my week and is very filling. But it's also emotionally exhausting because I do get triggered and think about those kids. I think about the kids that are still there, that are scarred with that day too. I think about, what have I done for those kids since? And I think that goes back to what I was talking about that dichotomy. And I work really hard to be in service of others. And I still think, am I really doing it? Am I advocating for the oppressed? Am I advocating for the person who's in jail? Am I advocating for them? And sometimes I feel like I'm not, because if I'm not yelling about this all the time, then I'm forgetting the memory of those kids. But also, working with kids today is a blessing from God that I've been given to heal the wound, to respond to that, because that was my life. That I can't take that away. That's who I am. That's part of who I am. And so is being the person who gives the children's sermons. And so I do enjoy it. Again, it's that dichotomy. It's suffering, but wanting to serve.
Yeah. Well, I guess lastly, it's Easter week. It's an Easter week unlike any that anyone alive really has ever had, as we're all separate due to the coronavirus crisis, and we'll be celebrating on our own online and in different ways. How do you put this period in perspective? How do you relate, this crisis to everything you've been through, everything you've lived through? What's your message to people out there looking for some hope this Easter Holy Week, despite all the tragedy and the struggle that we're going through?
Sure. So I think this is one of the realest Lents that we've ever experienced. What Lent is supposed to do is point you towards the cross. And at the end of the day, we are members of a religion that call our God someone who was executed and died and experienced suffering. And so those are the realities. And we look at the resurrection as new life. And so the idea is we don't know what new life will look like. We don't know what life will look like when we go back to normal, because there will be no going back to normal. And so we just have to have faith that if we continue to support each other, if we continue to isolate and remain in our houses, we will save ourselves for the future. And there's, scripture can guide us here. The apostles locked themselves away when Jesus died. They locked themselves in a house and they did not want to face the world. And it was Mary it was a mother, because it's always mothers who need to be serious. They're the ones who respond to the crisis because they don't have the opportunity to ignore it. And so I think I don't want to, have a hollow, let's look at the good things about this, which are, we're coming together, we're experiencing. I want us to appreciate that this is extremely hard, that we are collectively grieving, but that there will be new life after this. That it's a fact. That's just how it works. So that resurrection, that resilience that we are building together, the relationships we're building now just make us stronger in the future. And then to relate it back to me personally and to my story, I think that I've seen through my suffering, and it makes me think of a question that you asked on Persona. How do we understand this suffering? Why would this violence? So that one day we can help others. So that one day we know what it's like to grieve. And so we can say and do the things that somebody needs us to do or say to respond to their grief. I think suffering is not good in its sort of self. It's not a pejorative either. It's the meaning that we give our suffering in order to serve others around us. It is so important. And so, that's all I got.
Amen to that. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. I think we'll take that on this Easter week. Reverend Burke, this was a pleasure. It was so great to talk to you, to get to know you more and to hear your story. I hope others out there hearing it who are going through struggles, and there are a lot of them out there, and there always will be, take something from this. Happy Easter to you. Hope to see you again in person very soon.
Passover, yes. Thank you so much.